记录啊，滑着滑着点到那个。我故意去看，故意去找，上面有一些好看的呀。怎么了？怎么了？怎么了？不行了？对啊，他打电话这么尴尬。
How much CPU power do you actually need to avoid bottlenecking the RTX 3080? That's exactly what we're taking a look at today. As we've seen, this GPU, even at 1440p and 4K in some games, can deliver some seriously high frame rates. That means that you have a much greater chance of running into a CPU bottleneck on your gaming system. So we're going to be taking a look at some instances where you could be leaving quite a bit of performance on the table if you are pairing the RTX 3080 with a less than ideal CPU, because this GPU does push out quite a high frame rate. It does render frames quite fast, and it is very easy to run into a CPU bottleneck, even at 1440p resolution. But don't worry, there are equally as many instances where you might not need to upgrade your CPU, especially if you've bought one in the previous 2 existing gaming system planning on making an upgrade are probably wondering whether you really need to upgrade both of these parts. And for most of you, a CPU upgrade today will probably require a new motherboard and maybe even a new set of memory. But before we come to that, we first need to understand what CPU bottlenecking is, why it happens, and why it's a problem. CPU bottlenecking in the context of PC gaming is when your CPU is holding back your GPU from its full rendering potential. Instead of your GPU being completely utilized in-game between 98 and 100%, you might see it dip towards 85% usage or even lower, and therefore outputting a lower frame rate than what it potentially could. And the reason it does this is because it spends some time actually idling, waiting for the CPU. This usually happens when simply your CPU is a bit overloaded and can't keep up with the rate of which your GPU is rendering frames. That is, the time that it takes the GPU to render a single frame is shorter than the time that is spent for the CPU to prepare it, as well as handling a bunch of other things like game logic and network processing. You might have heard the terms CPU bound or GPU bound. That basically defines either of these 2 scenarios. Ideally, you want your gaming system to be GPU bound, and avoiding a CPU bottleneck completely, this is going to give you the best gaming performance and experience. Now, one reason that you could find yourself CPU bottlenecked in game is simply because you don't have enough CPU cores and threads, but you probably don't need as many as you think. In fact, the difference in gaming performance between a quad-core Ryzen 3300X and a 6-core Ryzen 5 3600 is slim, although the quad-core in this case does have the faster core-to-core latency, so it does have a slight advantage. But when comparing the 6-core 3600 against the 8-core 3700X, we can see that, yeah, there are a few games out there that do actually scale up to 8 cores and 16 threads. It is rare, and most games do perform the same here, but typically these titles will involve quite a bit of game logic, AI, and physics processing, racing games for example, but not just limited to those. It's also important to acknowledge that although you might have a 12 or 16 core CPU, that is not enough alone to avoid a CPU bottleneck, because all of those cores and threads only help you up to a certain point. I think most of us can agree at this point, after tons of CPU testing, that 6 cores and 12 threads seems to be the real sweet spot in terms of CPU performance scaling in games, and 8 cores and 16 threads is really where you might see some future-proofing potential and some additional performance in some games. And with most mainstream gaming CPUs today having around 6 to 8 cores, the biggest factor that separates them is single-threaded performance, and directly tied to that, clock speed. A lot of the work and processing that the CPU is responsible for today in games is still not heavily multi-threaded work. That's why it's possible for a 6-core i5-10600K to actually beat a 16-core Ryzen 9 3950X in quite a lot of games out there. So now let's take a look at a few different games and a few different spec'd CPUs to see where you would and would not be bottlenecking an RTX 3080. Now, usually when it comes to testing CPU gaming performance, we stick to 1080p resolution, seeing as beyond that, frame rates are low enough at 1440p and 4K that the margins between the majority of modern CPUs is within single-digit percentage points. But the RTX 3080 changes that. In fact, in games like Death Stranding, which scale bottlenecking an RTX 3080. Now, usually when it comes to testing CPU gaming performance, we stick to out there that do actually scale up to 8 cores and 16 threads. RTX 3080 at 1440p, such as the 10600K. If you have and pairing either of these CPUs with an RTX 3080 would be fine. You will technically be CPU bottlenecked at both 1080p and 1440. An Intel Core i5 or i7 between Haswell and Kaby Lake would likely be in the same boat. Now, Rainbow Six represents a really interesting CPU testing scenario where the game isn't too graphically intensive at all, so a high-performance GPU like the 3080 can render a single frame in under 2 milliseconds. That means it's up to the CPU to process a draw call for the GPU in addition to everything else it's handling in that time or less, otherwise you will be technically CPU bottlenecked. bottlenecked. Although I will mention that it's not like your experience would change much beyond 300 frames per second though, if we're all honest. When looking at the 1440p results, we can see that anything under 350 FPS, this game is mostly GPU bound, and that's by no means slow. So a Ryzen 3300X and RTX 3080 sounds like a pretty insane pairing, but it would make sense here at 1440p in this game. The only users who would really need to worry here are those with Zen or Zen Plus processors like the R5 2600 or prior. There you will be leaving some performance margins on the table, although again we are talking about 300 FPS and above. Next up, let's take a look at Red Dead Redemption 2 running at 1440p with mostly high settings. And this is a gaming scenario which I think the RTX 3080 fits quite well. Here you will see performance scaling all the way up to a 10900K, but it's not by a whole lot. In fact, with a Ryzen 3300X or 2600, you will be getting most of the way there and not holding up the 3080 by too much. When we take a look at the bar charts though, where those processors are going to fall behind a little bit is on the average, but mostly in the slowest 1% of frames delivered. That shows itself in-game as the frame-to-frame consistency and the smoothness overall of the gameplay, and there is a fair bit of ground to be made up. Now on to F1 2020, a game which is quite heavy with simulation and processing on the CPU side of things, and it does scale quite well when it comes to CPU clock speed and single-threaded performance. Although we are looking at 1080p resolution here, this represents what you can expect on the more competitive gaming side of things, as opposed to Red Dead Redemption 2, which we just looked at previously. We can see at 1440p that we still get some performance scaling. The Ryzen 3300X and 3950X are virtually tied here, and I'd expect that to be fairly consistent with other 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. As we've seen across the board though, it's definitely 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen owners who really should be considering a CPU upgrade if they are planning on going with the RTX 3080. Also keep in mind that this is with the highest quality preset available in this game, so if you're planning on going with an RTX 3070 instead, for example, and dropping things to around medium or high, you'd likely end up in the same spot in terms of CPU bottlenecking. So don't get too hung up on resolution specifically. You could still easily be CPU bottlenecked at 4K if your quality settings are low enough and hence your frame rate is high enough. So when it comes to avoiding CPU bottlenecks with the RTX 3080, the first question that you need to ask yourself is what resolutions and settings are you going to be playing at? And secondly, in what types of games? I think most of us would agree that an RTX 3080 at 1080p resolution would be mostly a waste of GPU potential. You're almost always going to be CPU bottlenecked. That's why in most of our graphs you actually don't see much of a performance dip when moving to 1440p, as the RTX 3080 is able to be of more use there. And so as we've seen, even at 1440p, the RTX 3080 can push high enough of a frame rate and render frames fast enough to push your gaming experience into a CPU bound one. 4K gaming is going to be much less of an issue with CPU bottlenecking, unless you're planning on dropping the graphics settings to around medium to acquire a higher frame rate. Even there, CPU choice does matter. So hopefully this video outlines some scenarios and gaming situations where you could run into a CPU bottleneck.
packet distribution.
Hold them steady now.
一件衣服解决所有问题。下半场。
Jawohl, Kommandant. Sie scheinen sich schnell zu nähern.
visible. Move it to intercept.
Roger. Mental attack is imminent. Do not engage.
White van, left side.
Target 1.